that we are trying to analyze since so many years ago about irrigation systems and water management as a way to transform, to build landscapes, cultural landscapes based on agroecosystems, but also as a social option of peasant and a peasant strategy with an Islamic origin. We will concentrate in Al-Andalus, and mainly we will concentrate in Granada and Almeria areas, that even when we have made also some other research in other places of Spain, Morocco, and Sicily, and so on. So I won't talk about the theoretical framework, but I think it's important just to mention some concepts. The first one is biocultural heritage and the agrarian heritage are at the base of the research. The concept of socio-ecological system, the transdisciplinary focus, that's what we try to do, trying to go beyond the disciplinary borders. And then, of course, the participatory approaches, because we always try to start working with the local communities, mainly with the farmers and the communities managing water communally. That includes a dialogue of knowledge between traditional ecological knowledge and the academic knowledge, not just from archaeology or history or anthropology, but also coming from natural science or engineering. And then, of course, in the field of archaeology, we always try to work in an integrated way, making our documentation as complex as possible, and trying to relate or all the archaeological data, archaeological knowledge with the rest of the elements of the landscape. So working or being an archaeologist specialized in medieval archaeology and mainly Islamic archaeology, when I'm asked about the main inherited or the main cultural heritage coming from the Islamic period in Al-Andalus, most people wait or think I'm going to mention the Alhambra or the Mosque of Cordoba or Medina Zahara. But of course, for us, the main cultural heritage coming from the Islamic period are the water management system and the settlement network directly linked to them, and the cultural landscape that were created because of the water management. And it is so because of the environmental impact, because of the social significance, because of the effort, the energy, the amount of work, and the transformation of the landscape that in many cases is radical, and it's still in use or has been in use until recent times. But first of all, we should just mention quite briefly what's an irrigation system. We will just distinguish two different levels: the technical unit and the social unit. The technical unit, following the technical unit, we would say that an irrigation system is formed by a catchment point and a main canal or main channel that it's usually called the mother, and then the branches or the diversions coming from that mother and the associated infrastructures. This is an example very close to Granada with the catchment point, the mother, and the main branches. But then we have the social unit, that is not only the community managing the water, but that includes a social distribution of the water that is the most important and the most complex element, and spatially the way that the water is distributed, following the water rights and following the governance rules for the social distribution of water. This is the same system that we have seen before, but you can see color the district, the distribution of the water, depending on the turns that for the distribution of the water. So sometimes, or many times, we have just one system and one social unit, vega or huerta. But so many other times we can find differences, so they don't coincide, and we find one system that is managed by different social units, different communities, forming different vegas, different irrigated spaces from a social point of view. We can sometimes we see that those systems are joined, and we cannot see spatially the differences, but so many other times they are differentiated or they are separated, and that depends, for example, in topography. And some other times we can find that there are more than one system that are managed just by a single social unit, by a single community, and they form socially one single irrigated space. So just one one vega or one huerta. This variety is very interesting from a historical point of view, because that allow us, or that give us information about the evolution of the territory and the evolution of the settlement network and the water management system. But then we should understand that the introduction or the construction of the irrigation system means ecosystem transformation, many times a radical transformation of the ecosystems, or a radical transformation of the previous landscape before the construction of this system. And they create new complex and delicate balances with nature, but also socially, because water is an scarce but an essential good, and that's quite evident in semi-arid or arid contexts, like many of the ones that we studied. So hydraulic systems, water management systems, are the result we will see of a social option, but they are the result of a huge collective effort. They were mainly created during the Islamic period, and mainly during the early Islamic period, between the 8th and the 10th centuries. There are a lot of discussions about the chronology and the difficulties to date the systems and so on, but they are the result of a communal, of a collective effort made by the peasants, where usually the state has no presence, doesn't interfere in the construction, the social distribution of water, the water rights, and the productive or the production of the peasant communities. And it's important to highlight that it's a collective effort, but also that it's a huge effort, because it's not just the building or digging the canals. These you can see in blue part of the network, just in Sierra Nevada and the surrounding area. We have something like 3,000 kilometers of canals just in Sierra Nevada and the surrounding area, and we think that should be something like a fifth of the total amount of the channels. But well, we have also published in Regadío Histórico-S. That's a collaborative tool with the irrigated communities to document the irrigation systems in Granada and Almeria. And you can see here the data that are really amazing. Most of them comes from the Islamic period, and all of these are traditional, so mainly before the 20th century. But as I said, that doesn't mean just the construction of the channels, of the canals, but also the transformation of the soil. the destruction and the creation and construction of new soil. Sometimes quite in a radical way, when you have to build terraces. That means also to build the walls and the paths for to get to the fields. But in any case, the necessity also to create or to produce fertile soils and to maintain the fertility of the soil in intensive productive systems that are continuously producing annually at least one crop, but usually that's the most common, quite common, 2 crops per year, or even 3 crops per year. So irrigation and water management in general, it's a social option, and it's the main social option for this society that condition the rest of the activities, economic activities, and condition also the way the territory is managed, and including the land ownership. But introducing irrigation means, as I said before, the transformation of the ecosystem, the transformation of the previous landscapes, and the conditions introduced by human beings transform also the natural conditions. So humans are adapting to the natural conditions, but also nature is adapting to the new conditions introduced artificially by human. And the landscapes, the cultural landscapes resulting, or that we can see currently, are the result of a co-evolutive process, but also the result of the formation, the generation, and the continuously evolving ecological knowledge, traditional or local ecological knowledge, that is related not only to water, in our case also to solid water, snow, and surface and underground waters, but it's also related with soil, plants, and animals, both domestic and wild plants and animals. And that traditional knowledge includes also artifacts, complex artifacts also, as the water mill that you can see there in the picture, that was already documented in the first half of the 16th century. It was a previous water mill coming from the Islamic period, and it has been in use until the middle of the 20th century. So it has been in use for at least 500 years. And these are the protagonists, the current protagonists that we can find still nowadays. They are mainly old farmers. The last representative of the peasantry from an anthropological perspective that is disappearing just in front of us, and with them all these traditional ecological knowledge and practices, communal practices, are also disappearing. Despite
Sorry, Jose, we cannot hear you anymore.
no?
Yeah, okay.
Can you?
Yes, now yes, okay.
Don't know what has happened.
Okay. Now it's working again. Okay.
Okay, so you, I hope you can listen about the.
We got the beginning of
Okay,
this.
so these are, as I was just mentioning, that this is the last generation of peasants from an anthropological perspective, that representative of this traditional ecological knowledge and the traditional practices. And I was saying that all these systems have been in use in many cases, at least for 1,000 years. And they have demonstrated to be sustainable and to have a great resilience capacity. And this is, as I said, they are a social option that condition all the other productive economic activity in the area. But why? What's the reason? Oh, don't know what has happened. Yeah, are you okay? What is the reason to irrigate? Why doing so much effort? Well, first, the introduction of irrigation has been always related with the so-called Arab Green Revolution, or the agricultural revolution in the Arab world, with the introduction of new crops in the Mediterranean, coming from monzonic or tropical climate. So the idea to make coincide heat and humidity in the Mediterranean allowed to introduce all these crops. But the diversification has to do also with the season enlargement, or the possibility to introduce Mediterranean crops in many other Mediterranean areas, or to increase also the production of these Mediterranean crops. But there are two other elements that I think are more significant, and the first one is the productivity increase by surface unit. That has also consequences. We cannot talk about that because of the lack of time, but that means more energy by surface, so change also the relationship between work, labor, and land, and then and that means also to change the relationship between occupied or productive agrarian productive land and the rest of the territory. That has also consequences for the land ownership, the private ownership of the land, and the communal land. And the third element that I think is it's even probably more important is the possibility to regularize the production in a context like the Mediterranean one, but it's quite unstable and quite difficult to predict. The possibility to irrigate the crops once or more than once allow to guarantee in some way the production. So that's quite an advantage, so that you can not only make an estimation, but it's also a very important mechanism to avoid the debt mechanism and the personal dependence. So it's a very interesting and important mechanism to avoid the feudal relationship formation in Islamic society. Increase by surface unit, or the production regularization, that is said they have many consequences, not only related directly with the irrigation system, but it related also with the territorial management, with the land ownership, with the relationship between local rural communities and the power. But I would like also to highlight another element that is also very important, is that irrigation, it is usually not isolated. It's the main social option in terms of productivity. Manage irrigation.
Jose, we still up.
Sorry? Can you hear me? No.
Yes, now yes. There was again a bit problem with the microphone, I think. But yes, now we can hear you again.
Okay. Thank you. So I was saying that the irrigation system is part of a much more complex socio-ecosystem, and that's important also to be highlighted, including, as I said before, private and common land and private and common land management. But it's that includes also many other different uses and productions, cattle, forestry, with places with different intensity in land use and so on. And those spaces and productions can be separated or can be just not separated, but mixed and even overlapped, which makes more complex to distinguish land uses and productive orientation. And I would like to show you just one example of in this case, this Ferreira is an example of one system that is formed just was one social unit, is managed just by one community, with a very interesting differentiation or between this, well, in the lower part of the picture, this more irregular irrigation network that are the intensively irrigated area. So that the lands with the right to be irrigated during the summer, and then in the upper part of the picture, this more regular fields that are irrigated just in case that there are water enough. So there is water usually during the spring, but not during the summer. So all this land has not the right to be irrigated during the summer. This difference is a very interesting mechanism of adaptation to scarcity, the adaptation also to the presence of snow in the mountains. So, but it's also very interesting differentiation in the medieval period between the intensive irrigated lands that are private property and the land that is irrigated just in case there is enough water, that used to be common land. This is the same system, just intensively irrigated land, and the red spots are archaeological sites. This is the result of this survey, the hydraulic survey and the archaeological survey of the area. I'm not going to talk about the chronology and the evolution of the settlement, but well, you can see also the intensity of the occupation of the area. And here you have in color the different areas with the social distribution of the water in turns during the summer. The Monachil River, where the ski station is, just up in the mountain, very close to Granada. It's another interesting case. In the river, you can see all these acequias that are the canals, are different systems, all of them managed by different communities that has to share the water coming from the river. So there are water rights already established at the same time in the early medieval period to distribute the water in the fields. This is one of the catchment points in the river, and this is the map of the irrigated of the irrigation system, each one with one different color. You can see how complex and how extended it is. In this case, in Jerez del Marquesado, you can see 5 different irrigation systems that originally in the 8th century and until the 11th century were owned by 5 different villages: Bartillana, Micena, Nuj, Tugina, and Alcázar. All of them started to be abandoned from the 12th century onward, and there was a concentration aggregation of land, water rights, irrigated land. So the final result in the 15th century was that the 5 villages were concentrated in a single village, that is Jerez del Marquesado, that is the one that still exists. And the 5 different systems survived, and they are still in use, following the same water rights, and the water is not mixed, not even mixed. So the water rights, consolidated water rights, have survived to the villages. And here we have a different example, just the opposite, a segregation process. In this case, with one original village, Lanteira, that you can see, well, that until the 11th century occupied all the territory, and in the 11th century, the foundation of a new village that is linked to, is just in here, that is linked to the construction of a castle, controlling the iron mines of Alquife, and the creation of a new village. So the segregation of the irrigated land with colored in yellow, but also the segregation of the other kind of lands of the territory that we won't talk about. So those systems, the irrigation systems, were traditionally considered ultra stable, following the Thomas Glick interpretation of the Valencia, or the Huerta de Valencia mainly, following also the water rights already established in many cases from the medieval period. But I think we should talk more about resilient systems, because it's true that in many cases we can see that they have survived, that they are still in use, but the water rights in many cases has not been modified, that also the channels, the acequias, have not been modified, even when they are cleaned, maintained annually. But the real or concept, or we could say the base of the systems, are their capacity to adapt to changes, not only political, social, or even long-term climate changes, but also annually, or even in a short term, their capacity to adapt, for example, to scarcity. And that's a very important issue in the Mediterranean, because the communities have to be able to adapt to not only to inter-annual changes, climate changes, but also to intra-annual climate changes and new conditions. And that is related, as I said before, to traditional ecological knowledge that is always being renewed annually to adapt to new conditions. So the communities are always evolving and changing without changing, but that is also related to governance institutions, to the common governance institution ruling, managing communally the water. They have their own institutions to govern the water, to maintain also the infrastructure, but also to solve the conflicts that are quite common. So all the communities have a tribunal. The most well-known is the Tribunal de las Aguas de Valencia, or the Tribunal de los Hombres Buenos de Murcia. Both are UNESCO heritage, intangible heritage. But all the communities, doesn't matter if they are small communities, have a judge, that it's called the Jurado de Aguas. They all have a tribunal, and they have mechanisms to solve the conflicts that are quite common. Because as the farmer says, usually said, water burns or water heat more than wine. And they are resilient also because they are based also in complementarity between uses, between spaces, including also water uses that are not, that is not only used for intensive agriculture, but it's also used for meadows, for artificial aquifer recharge, so for sowing and harvesting water, and that that is responsible also for the creation of many ecosystem services that have been always very important for local communities, but currently they are even more important in the current framework of global change and climate change. And despite this specialization, the agrarian specialization, water management allows a high level of diversification in the agrarian production. And that is also one of the main elements to guarantee the peasant community's subsistence. That is one of the bases of the peasant economy. And so just for finishing, the water management systems are important, as I said before, because of the capacity of adaptation, because of the productive increase, because of the system. But there should be some social conditions that allow the creation and the maintenance of irrigation. The first one, as I said before, is the communal management. So the social cohesion also of the community. As I always say to the student, the most difficult thing in the construction of an irrigation system are not the technical issues. The technical issues can be solved even if they are complex, but the most difficult thing is to share the water. The most difficult thing is to agree, establishing the water rights without killing each other. And that is the key to understand the capacity or not to create the irrigation system. And that is also the key to understand the productive strategy and the main orientation of the agrarian activity. And then, of course, it is also important, it's essential to understand which are the traditional or the local, which is the traditional or the local ecological knowledge linked to water management, to the irrigation systems, and to the rest of the socio-ecological system. So not all societies are able to irrigate or to establish irrigated agriculture as the main productive option in a territory. There are some social conditions that are essential, or the key to understand the orientation of the economy. So I hope that this brief perspective of the irrigation systems on the not only the social importance but also the historical interpretation can give us from an archaeological perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I guess we have a few minutes for questions, if there are questions in the room or online.
Yes, also because Jose won't be able to join the discussion at the end of the day. So if there are questions, is
very good. So
is now.
Are there questions in the room?
I have.
Yeah, maybe one.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
You want the microphone?
Can you hear me?
Well, we can turn this and see if it works, because the other microphone isn't really reliable. So let's see.
Hi, can you hear me? Is that it?
Yes.
My name is Stephen McPhillips. Thanks, that was really interesting. I've been working a bit in Lebanon and seen some similar systems in some places. I just wanted to ask you, do you see a difference in the crops being irrigated on the high slopes? What's the effect of altitude on how these systems works? I don't know whether you can answer that, but the second question is, what do you think the areas were being used for before? Do you have any clues as to what agricultural systems or forestry or pastoralism, what might have been happening, and why the change here in particular and in this high mountain area?
Of course, there is a difference in crop production depending on the bioclimatic floors in altitude that you can see even currently. Now, for example, we can see how the tropical crops like avocados are being cultivated more and more high in the slope of the mountains. And it depends a lot, not only in altitude, but also in isolation and the exposition to the sun, because there are great differences between one side or the other, the shadow or the sunny part of the valleys. But what the irrigation allows is to mix more, to have a more diverse production. So in many places you can even see chestnut and orange trees together. Both are probably in the limit, but it's a quite curious and singular mixture. But of course, one of the conditions is the altitude and the exposition to the also to the sun, and of course also the soil conditions. So that's why I always prefer to talk not only about when I talk about traditional ecological knowledge, not only about water, that is the main element, but all the other knowledge is always related and cannot be separated from the other one. So that's also a key question for the selection of the crops, even nowadays, and even when the crops have been modified and has changed a lot along the time. That's the most easy element to change. That the most easy element that has been modified during the history, mainly with the inclusion of new crops related with the exportation oriented to the markets and so on. And that's also a question to take into account, not only in the mountainous areas, but we work also in many other places, flat areas, semi-arid or even arid areas in desertic land. So it's something very important to take into account. Regarding the previous situation, it depends a lot on the area. If we talk about the Sierra Nevada and the mountainous area, it seems that now we have done an intensive research since so long ago, that there was the mountainous area has mainly vocation for cattle, so and quite related to not only to transhuman but also short transhumans. In Spanish is transtermitente. So since the prehistory, at least since the Bronze Age, but there is no intensive occupation of the mountain in terms of settlement until the late Roman period. From in the 6th and 6th century, there is an assault to the mountain, and we have the first villages, stable villages, documented in the area, dedicated to probably an extensive production. There is also a very interesting renewal of the mining activity and the metallurgy in all the area of the mountain in the 5th, 6th century. but the situation that the Arab find when they arrived to these mountainous areas in the 8th century, it's an occupied mountain, probably with quite an extensive production based on an extensive agriculture and cattle and mining, and then the mining activity. That's what we know until now.
Thank you very much. We have another question online from Stefano Campana.
Yes, here I am. Okay, so first of all, I would congratulate with Jose for, the very interesting talk. And let's say I just get into this subject, so water management and irrigation, pretty recently, in the last 5 years. And I also think that, for instance, in Italy, this is rather under-evaluated. And it's really fascinating because, I would say that water management is a subject that is always there in let's say, past societies, because water is always too much or too less, often at the wrong time. So, the control of water is definitely super important within any society. I was also very fascinated when I realized that there is a deep connection. When Jose was talking about the issues and the fights related with water, I was very fascinated when I realized that in Italian, the term rivale is associated with riva, which means, the etymology of the word has a very close connection with the management of water and the control of water. However, now, my question to Jose is about this landscape, and is about how did he identify for instance, the channels and the irrigation systems. From what I understood, most of them are still visible, and I was wondering, the systems that are not visible, if are detectable in some way, or just by field walking and direct observation of the field. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefano. Most of the systems here are in use. Some of them, or mainly part of them, has been recently abandoned. Recently means even 60 years ago, 40 years ago, but there is a memory alive, and you still can see the remains of the channels. But most of them are still in use, many times or sometimes modified with concrete. There is a very important public investment in the transformation. I would say the destruction of these systems with being transformed into modern, technified, pressured irrigation. We have a very strong, a very hard debate about all these policies and orientations of intensification and industrialization of agriculture. So, but one of the things that we have been trying to do during the last, in 15 years, is trying to, not only develop the methodology in the field and the database and the GIS and so on, but also trying to improve the workflow for the detection and the cartography of the channels, using or including mainly also remote sensing.
Okay, yeah.
And it's in most of the occasion is completely impossible. Because you can, of course, because the channels are quite narrow, they are not very big. The big ones are not difficult at all. The big ones are you can detect them quite well. And doesn't matter if you are in the mountainous areas or in a flat area. The other problem is even if you can detect part of the channels, you won't detect by remote sensing all the connections between the branches. So you need that connection. You
Absolutely.
can maybe detect a piece of the channel.
Yeah,
It
you
doesn't matter if
can
it's-
find junctions, of course.
Yes, doesn't matter if you are working with satellite images or aerial pictures or with LiDAR. You would find mainly pieces. Sometimes you can even not say for sure if it's a piece of a channel or any other element in the the landscape. But we have another problem with that. That is the direction of the water. I mean, you can detect in many times a piece of channel, but you cannot say if the water goes in one direction or the other.
Because it's flat, you mean?
Yes, and because the channels have a very small slope, usually very small slope. I mean, not only in the flat areas, but also in the mountainous areas. To enlarge to extend the irrigation as much as possible, but also to avoid erosion. So
Yeah,
that's also another difficulty to work with remote sensing. So we keep on trying that so that we can complement both, and we can be also more efficient in the cartography and detection. But
it's a challenge.
Yes, but it's something very difficult because of these conditions, and as I said, and it's something that we keep on working, because of course also technologies are more sophisticated and more precise. So and we are always trying to
two very quick remarks. Yes. Well, the first one is that be sure that I'm going to write you.
Yes.
And to share some ideas and some work that I did here in Italy. And the second one is, so you mean that are still in use? I mean, from the Middle Age or the early Middle Age?
Yes.
That's really impressive. It's really impressive because, as you said, I mean, it implies, I mean, maintenance, which I mean is, I mean, giving continuity to this kind. I mean, how much time do you think is needed? I mean, to delete, I would say, not the system, but maybe, yeah, because I mean, just few years can be enough. I mean, to or it's possible to have some gaps in between and to get the system back in use.
Well, one of the key questions about the irrigation system is the chronology, but also how much time do you need to build an irrigation system? It is probably something created in more than one generation. Even when we are not conscious, we are not aware of the peasant community of work. Their capacity of work is really high. It's really amazing. So one of the important things is to try to understand the design, the original design. That was one of the keys of one of the principles already established by Miquel Barceló and his team in the 90s. But usually the water rights are established at the same time, because it's quite difficult then to modify them. Not only to modify the trays of the channels, mainly the main channels and the main infrastructure, but it is very difficult then to modify the water rights once they are established. So that these are the elements that are usually stable, that cannot be modified.
Okay, yeah. I understand what you mean. Okay.
So
thank you very much. I'm sorry, but time is flying, and we could.
Okay.
So our next speaker, thank you very much again, Jose.
Thank you.
For your
thank you.
Presentation. And our next speaker is Anthony Quickel. He's a research fellow at the University of Marburg and a coordinator of the EG Landscape project, which is a joint DFG and ANR research project. So I leave him the floor. You need to change the computer.
Thank you, Laurent, and special thank you to Nicolo for organizing this and inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about our project. I'm going to be doing this in a bit of a mixed way today. The first part will be kind of prepared remarks as I talk about the state of the art and our research questions and those sorts of things. And then after that, I'll be talking a bit more informally about how our project is designed and the contributions it's made, and what its work has been. Before beginning, I want to say that the EG Landscape Project is a bit different than many of the projects that we've discussed here today. And we discussed, yesterday and today, I'm sure, in that it is not archaeological. We have no field work, we have no excavations. Instead, the project is about bringing together historians and archaeologists to try to collaborate and think about how we can approach the topic of Egypt's medieval landscape. For a variety of reasons, there's been little archaeology of Egypt's quote unquote Islamic past outside of the urban areas and urban spaces. So this project is really about how can we think about the medieval landscape and how can we push those boundaries of that topic forward. Theoretically, Egypt's historical landscape should be one of the most and best understood and detailed in the world. Egypt has been the focus of the world's fascination since even in antiquity. The first historian, Herodotus, was one of its earliest tourists, and already its monuments were ancient by his time. For our purposes, the archaeological and historical exploration of the Nile Valley really began in earnest with the Napoleonic expedition in the French occupation, during which Napoleon's famous scientists, savants, began the preparation and writing of the Description d'Egypte. Thereafter followed 2 centuries of quite intense and widespread study, yet the historical landscape of Egypt during the medieval or Islamic period is rather recent, starting only substantively in the middle of the 20th century. Since then, archaeologists have become sensitive to the natural and human context of the settlements they study, but face an absence of data in the Islamic period, especially after the 12th century. Historians, and especially medievalists, must deal with a limited corpus of available sources and move beyond a traditionally Cairo-centric history in order to open the field of research to rural and environmental studies. As a result, the state of research on natural and human spaces in Egypt has now finally reached a threshold where reflection cannot progress without pulling together disciplines and periods. So archaeologists and historians, but also periods like the late Middle Ages, i.e. the Mamluk period, which is about 1250 to 1517, and the early modern, which is the Ottoman period, 1517 to about 1800. It is because of this that we propose the EG Landscape Project. And today I'm going to talk about this project, and in so doing, give some general background to the field of study, and then talk about how our project has addressed some of these questions, what we've been doing, what our activities have been. And finally, I'll talk about our GIS mapping project that we're currently developing called A Survey of Medieval Egypt.
Oh, wait, there's a problem in sharing online, so sorry.
No problem.
See. Okay, let's do. Screen, it's easier. Okay. There we go.
Okay, before moving on to a discussion of the state of the art and how the project has worked to advance the field, I want to first give some general background of the overall project. Oh, it's disappeared.
All right.
The EG Landscape Project came out of a discussion by Professor Nicolas Michel, who you can see on the left, who is currently Professor of History at Aix-Marseille University, but was at that time Director of Studies at the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in Cairo, along with Professor Albrecht Fuss, who is a Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Marburg, and myself. The 3 of us had been previously involved in a research project related to transmission of knowledge in the Middle East, and increasingly found that our interests were actually more aligned with a different sort of project than what we were working on, and thus began the EG Landscape Project. The project receives joint funding from the French ANR and the German DFG, and it's institutionally hosted by Aix-Marseille University and the University of Marburg. We have partnerships with the IFAO in Cairo, the American Research Center also in Cairo, as well as the Centre d'études alexandrines in Alexandria, and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. The project was initially funded for 3 years, but because of COVID, we've received a 1-year extension to kind of wrap up the final phase. And a little bit later, I'll talk about our activities and research teams, but I wanted to give you some background so you can see where the project is coming out of. Okay. The environmental history of Egypt in the pre-modern period is a newly emerging field. Most extant work has primarily focused on Egypt's agricultural history, especially its economic relevance for ruling regimes. Less research has explored the rural environment of Egypt within its ecological context or with regards to the impact of changing demography. The pre-modern hydraulic system is only beginning to be better understood, but its evolution is over the centuries and its impact on human geography remains to be clarified. Furthermore, while land use has been considered in light of farming and food production, we know far less about the nature of land ownership and its evolution during the 6 centuries under scrutiny by our project. Thus, it is important to widen the scope of study beyond the cultivator or the village by exploring the interplay between the urban and rural, as well as intra-village relationships. Large geographic stretches of Egypt remain nearly unstudied in both of the periods that we're interested in, especially the Western Desert and the Middle Nile Valley. Finally, there is a gap in the historical record regarding demographic settlement patterns and how these patterns were driven by ecological factors and catastrophes like the plague and regime direction. Environmental history as an all-encompassing category is a relatively new field, even more so in Egyptian history. This is particularly unfortunate with the great role that natural events and climate have played in the history of Egypt, given its natural environment and its precarious position at the edge of a hostile terrain. Furthermore, that the Nile Valley had organized government for millennia before other parts of the globe, there is a unique ability in the Egyptian environmental history to understand the interplay between human actions and their consequences in shaping the natural world. Despite these advantages, there's still much left to be learned about the history of Egypt's ecology and environment. In this arena, the vast majority of contemporary research until now has focused on farming. However, this scholarship has primarily treated agriculture as an economic concern. It is indisputable that agriculture was the primary source of Egypt's tax base and the foundation of its economy. However, forgetting that agriculture is part of a natural process and that land use extends beyond economic concerns has meant that studies have necessarily limited themselves in scope and approach. Here you can see some of the studies that I'm mentioning in the state of the art, and I have 2 more slides of this, so I'll move along so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. And they're not in alphabetical order, they're kind of in the order in which I'm speaking. So I hope that it kind of makes sense in that way. That these agricultural studies are in and of themselves restricted in scale is especially worrisome because for the period of study covered by the EG Landscape Project, almost all of the research that could fit within the realm of environmental history has been with regards to Egypt's agriculture. In Mamluk and Ottoman periods, particularly, there has been a great amount of research on this topic, and several important studies have shown the importance of agriculture to the maintenance and stability of the Mamluk regime. Whereas during the Ottoman period, the great majority of scholarship deals with the peasantry, the relationship to the land, and the larger economic issues of labor. Thus, in almost all cases, agricultural pursuits have been treated as a foundation for and function of economic activity, rather than activities ipso facto. This is in no way diminishes the value and impact of this scholarship, but rather it only points to the attention given to one aspect of agricultural history using an economic framework, and it illustrates the need for other approaches. In this direction, works like those of Hassanein Rabia and Gladys Franz Murphy explain the mechanics of and the technical aspects to the practice of farming in Egypt during the medieval period. And these works are among the few that approach agriculture outside of its economic consequence. With their focus on water usage, soil typography, and human environmental interactions, they come relatively close to the approach that the EG Landscape Project has sought to follow. Treating agriculture, landscape, and ecology as purely environmental issues is not the only approach followed by our project. In other ways as well, the landscape, environment, and humans' interactions with them have been and remain to be studied. One area concerns the relationship between urban centers of Egypt and their rural surroundings. The interplay between the urban and rural has been discussed in my own master's thesis and a subsequent publication, which has explored the ways in which rural food supplies were brought to Cairo's marketplaces. Looking at this relationship between the province's center and its hinterland creates the opportunity to set historians' eyes beyond Cairo, as has too often been the case. The vast majority of research in Mamluk and Ottoman studies regarding Egypt has been Cairo-centric, and looking at the countryside and rural spaces throughout the province provides many avenues for further inquiry. Nicolas Michel, our project co-director, has worked extensively on the issue of the countryside and its peasantry in Egypt, looking at the topic through many lenses: demographic, social, and economic. While this entire field remains to be explored, Michel is not alone. Working on a smaller microcosm within Egypt, Yusuf Rapoport, who is also one of our project's researchers, has shown the ways in which peasantry shared and cooperated on resource issues in Egypt's Fayoum region, especially water. It was actually in some ways very relevant to the last presentation. Rapoport has also looked at the peasantry in the Mamluk period, although not to the extent which Michel has developed the topic in the Ottoman period. One area where both Rapoport and Michel overlap is in looking at the movements of the royal peasantry in order to better understand demographic changes in both the Mamluk and Ottoman periods. These demographic shifts were a result of depopulation following the plague in the 14th century. The first occurrence, with many subsequent outbreaks in the succeeding centuries, represented major events in the patterns of settlement throughout the late medieval and early modern periods. The effects of the plague were also dramatic for Egypt's natural landscape. As the rural peasantry dramatically thinned, there was a huge decline in the labor force that was required for the maintenance of Egypt's hydraulic irrigation systems. In contrast to rain-fed agriculture in Europe and elsewhere, Egypt's reliance on flood-based irrigation meant that the irrigation systems had to work well and efficiently in order to harness and control the Nile's floodwaters. With the workforce having been depleted, the hydraulic network gradually broke down, and the entire agricultural system came under strain, as has been shown by in important contributions by one of our other project researchers, Stuart Borsch. The plague, however, was not alone in causing demographic shifts throughout Mamluk and Ottoman periods, and other natural disasters certainly had their own effects. Additionally, political, economic, and environmental factors certainly played roles. These demographic shifts, however, remain greatly understudied beyond an overall impression of population decline in the period of EG landscape study. As such, demography and the role that shifting populations played on the natural environment and landscape have been and remain a major area of focus and an important component of the project. The interplay between populations in demographic terms and the peasantry as a sociological unit that interacted daily with the land can only be fully understood in relationship to the Egyptian landscape within its Nile Valley, river delta, oases, and deserts. Without fully understanding this landscape, the placement of the population within the natural environment is detached from its context. Before beginning the project, there was no comprehensive scholarship by which this landscape could have been understood. Through the collaborative work of our project over the last 3 years, and as we wrap up this coming year and look forward to phase 2, this is the issue that we have most focused on addressing. As to Egypt's waterway, the Nile River, only one study tries to recreate the medieval waterscape and understand its relationship to the people and society living and working along its banks. This is John Cooper's Medieval Nile. And this book was in many ways groundbreaking in its attempt to recreate the medieval river and give context to its waterways, including its canals and transportation routes. While historians have for centuries commented on the importance of the Nile River as a lifeblood of Egypt, Cooper's book is the only major piece of scholarship which recognizes the importance and that importance and provides a portrait of the setting in which most of this history was occurring for our time period. I mean, I have to keep saying that because there's so much more work for ancient Egypt, but in the medieval Islamic context, there's so little. Regardless of scope, from studying the Delta peasantry in Mamluk Egypt to a grand theory of decline of the hydraulic system following the plague, the state of environmental history within Egyptian studies, especially in the Mamluk and Ottoman period, has left much to be explored and developed. In particular, there has been and remains a need for a reevaluation of sources with a greater cooperation between archaeologists and textual historians, as has begun by the EG Landscape Project. I hope that this has been a succinct but fairly comprehensive then overview of where things are and the research scene into which the EG Landscape Project has situated itself. From here, I just want to talk then about how the project has functioned and where it is hoped to make contributions to the fields. Okay. The major challenge for the EG Landscape Project is that nearly all of its members are attached to other institutions and are pursuing their own research interests. We're not kind of a directed project in this way. So the project functions more as and primarily as a coordinator and facilitator in gathering and fostering cooperation among research teams. Towards this end, all of our team members have met and worked together in various capacities, in person and virtually, in looking at the specific themes of the project. And this has been especially true at the 3 workshops we've had. We've also had small breakout Zoom sessions and things over the last few years, but these were the 3 big meetings we've had. 2 were in person, the first one in Marburg and the last one in Alexandria this past fall. The second one was virtual. It was in the midst of Corona in 2020. And our final conference will be this September in Aix-en-Provence, where we'll kind of wrap up some of these conclusions. The central theme and objective of these events has been to better understand the environment, ecology, and landscape of Mamluk and Ottoman Egypt, which has been the focus of all of our participants, as well as contributors and outside scholars that we've been inviting to these scientific meetings. And these themes have defined the activities and collaborative work of the group. To this end, we also have 3 working groups within the project, which are looking at various regions: the Delta around Kafr al-Sheikh, the Fayoum, which is in Middle Egypt, and Beni Suef in Upper Egypt. And I'll talk a little bit more at the end because those groups are going to form kind of the centerpiece of our next phase of the project. But we're hoping some of their preliminary findings of these groups will be presented in our final publication, and that will then launch phase 2. As the group is made up of a large number of researchers from a wide range of backgrounds and research interests, I'm putting them all, well, some are here and some are on the next slide for you to take a look at. And I'm going to talk about a number of them specifically in order to show how we've been supporting them and brought these scholars together within the framework of the project. Critical to the design of our research team was the inclusion of Egyptian scholars who are actually in Egypt. We have a number of Egyptian scholars that are also in Europe and in the US, but Egyptian scholars in Egypt have been one of our focuses. And to this end, we've brought on board Dr. Heba Saad Abdul Nebi of the Alexandria University, Dr. Magdi Gerges from Kafr al-Sheikh, Dr. Ahmed Abu Ghazi from Cairo University, and then we have a couple of researchers from other stages of their careers, like Shireen Al-Kabani from the Library of Alexandria and Dalia Hussein from the American University in Cairo. These researchers are working on a variety of topics, but I want to highlight 2 of them in particular to show how the project is facilitating and promoting its researchers. Dr. Heba Saad Abdul Nebi from the Alexandria University has focused her research on birds in the Mamluk period. This topic is a bit all-encompassing because before her work, there really was no ornithological studies. There was nothing about birds in the Islamic period in terms of how they were used, what they do. Her work looks at how they're represented in art. It looks at in other forms of material culture, their uses for hunting, in cuisine, and she has a very fun study of birds in pharmacology, so their uses for various types of ailments, etc. Our project has supported Dr. Heba by helping to finance the publication of one of her recent books on the topic. And additionally, and perhaps more importantly, it has provided connections for which she and another researcher, Dr. Alexander Shopov, who was working at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, was able to facilitate her getting a fellowship to come to Germany and to work with other researchers working on environmental history at the center in Berlin. Like Dr. Heba, Magdi Gerges has benefited from the project's support. Magdi works on a number of issues related to the Coptic Church during the Mamluk and Ottoman period. On one side, he is one of the only researchers in the world with access to the Coptic Patriarchate's cache of endowment deeds and other archival sources. But on the other, he has also done a great deal of work on the role of monasteries in rural communities. As such, the project has been financing some of his research missions. Recently, he did 2 to sites in Middle and Upper Egypt. And he has an upcoming research trip to Paris and to Brussels that we're also helping to support. So beyond just these 2 individuals, financial support for publishing, research expeditions, these sorts of things, which is especially difficult to receive in Egypt, but we all know can also be hard to get elsewhere, has been something that the EJ Landscape Project has been critical for. So bringing these scholars together, financing them, and allowing these things to happen. Here you can just see a few other members of our team on the top row. Alison Gascoigne at Southampton University has been one of the primary and most important Islamic archaeologists in Egypt, and she works on a site in the northeastern delta called Tanis, of which she has a new publication this past year, maybe year and a half. And she's kind of been our godmother of archaeological studies and kind of guided a lot of the kind of connections and things that we've thought about in terms of the archaeological landscape of Egypt. Alexander Shopov works on pests and locusts, but he also works on farming manuals in the Ottoman period. So his background has been really important in contributing another side to this. Zoe Griffith works on the Delta port cities. And so especially Rashid and Damiat, so Rosetta and Damiat. And she's been really important in giving us a coastal perspective to understanding the landscape as well. Daniel Martin Frisco works on agricultural manuals as well. And these agricultural manuals are one of the primary ways in which we know about actual practices, be descriptive practice as well as prescriptive practices in agriculture. He is based mostly on Rasulid Yemen, but most of these Rasulid texts are based on earlier Mamluk manuals. And so that's been invaluable. And I'm going to mention the last one, Greg Williams. He has worked with the Swiss Institute in Cairo in a salvage archaeological site in Aswan. And Aswan, although it is itself an urban center, now, especially in the medieval period, it was a regional hub. And it was really important as a connector between the cultures and peoples of Upper Egypt and those across the imaginary Islamic border with Nubia. So it was an important regional and provincial center during that period. Here are some of our other team members. I mean, you can just see there's such a wide variety of topics. In our project, Nicola is particularly working on oases and land use in the oases in the Ottoman period. I've been working on historical climatology and how that relates to land use. We have people, Mohammed Sha'ban is doing a mapping using Ibn Jiyan, who is a Mamluk chronicler, using one of his cadastral surveys from the 14th century in order to create a more comprehensive map of Egypt and show how land use patterns changed. Anthony Greco, who you can see is working on engineering projects in the rural landscape in the 19th century. He's kind of our latest in the time scale of our project historian. And then we have people working on the Western Delta. We have people working on seed distribution and land use, hunting. I mean, there's a wide variety of topics covering the scope of environmental, land, and other practices that are happening in the rural landscape of Egypt during this period. And really, this is a first of its kind project for Egypt, in which this diverse set of interests and this diverse set of research topics comes together in order to be able to discuss these things and start to think about the issues of the landscape and what it looked like during this period. Another thing that we've been doing is trying to engage with the larger community of historians specifically related to our field and more broadly. And this has been important because people that are working on the Mamluk and Ottoman period for Egypt aren't thinking about the landscape. They're not thinking about what's going on. I mean, in a broad way, they're not doing this. And so being present is also very important for establishing a base for this kind of work in this field of study. So we've been at the Mamluk Studies conferences, nearly all of them actually, unfortunately because of Corona, again, these got changed. At Mesa, the last Mesa that was in person, the GIS last year, and AUC's annual history seminar. And in fact, we're hosting and co-sponsors of this year's Mamluk Studies Conference, which will be in Marburg. Part of another important aspect of the project has been to do some forms of trainings for graduate students in using some of the resources that are necessary for kind of understanding this topic. And so in Alexandria this past year, when we had our workshop, we had a one-day training that was for over 30 Egyptian graduate students and early postdocs. This was held at the Institut Français in Alexandria. And you can see here, I mean, we looked at geography and history through different sources, textual, cartographic, so maps. We looked at what kind of archaeological surveys and information is available, so that this was shared with the participants. We also had a full session on maps as a tool. So we did some GIS work very superficially, but in order to introduce GIS to these Egyptian trainees, who in most cases, I would say out of the 30 of them, probably 28 of them didn't know what GIS was, even though they're in archaeological schools in Egypt or archaeology programs or history programs in Egypt. So just introducing the tool as a technique was an important way of giving access. And then we had a whole a thing with our partners, the Center for Alexandrian Studies, where they did a case study of mapping the Mareotis, Lake Mareotis in Alexandria, which has been a project that the Center for Alexandrian Studies has been doing for a number of years. It's one of these very few Islamic period, I mean, it's also pre-Islamic, but Islamic period sites in Egypt that has been surveyed archaeologically. So we had a working session on that. And this coming month in Marburg at the Mamluk Studies Conference, we're hosting a 3-day intensive course as well about environmental studies and approaches. So there will be a full day of introduction to GIS. So actually the students will download the software on their computers through QGIS, and they'll get again, a very precursory introduction to this as a tool so that they have some kind of familiarity with it as they move forward. We'll also have an introduction to archaeological methods. So Alison Gascoigne will do a full day of, LiDAR, remote sensing, all of these sorts of things, so that historians, because most of the students here will be historians, will have some idea of how to approach these kind of archaeological techniques or have some kind of familiarity with them and understand what they're doing. And then there will be a historiography day hosted by Nicola and Yossi Rappaport from Queen Mary College. So again, a full kind of day. The EG Landscape Project, in addition to hosting it for these 15 graduate students, which are coming from the US, Europe, and the Middle East, is also offering scholarships to 3 of the students to attend. So 2 of them will be PhD students from Egypt coming to Germany, and 1 will be a Turkish PhD student. The project also has developed a set of working papers on a number of these topics. We have 4 online. There are 4 that I'm currently going through and editing, and there are 6 more that we have scheduled to be published. So it'll be about 14 to 15 in total in the end. We've had a virtual lecture series that we've kind of started on and off during the academic year. We've done 3 until now. There's 7 planned for this final year. And in terms of publications, and in addition to supporting our own team members, we have a special issue of the Mamluk Studies Review coming out this year. Here you can see the table of contents for that. It'll come out in the autumn. probably September, October. But we're also planning to publish our final volume or volumes with the IFAO in Cairo. So this will kind of be the opening salvo of an attempt to open the door to these kind of landscape and environmental studies for this period in Egypt. The final major component of the project is our GIS, which we're calling the Survey of Medieval and Early Modern Egypt. It will be a mapping of these using these, I think these are the 1 to 50,000 series, the maps from the Survey of Egypt. I think this is from 1914, but there's also a 1941 series, I think, but this is being handled by a mapping team that we have. We also have a geographic engineer, I think is what his title is, but he's on the French side of the project, and he's helping us to develop this. The map will be featuring the villages, land and land boundaries, field and land boundaries, waterways and canals. And importantly, it'll also have a gazetteer, so it'll have all the village names and their sites. And a lot of this will be based on Ibn Jian's 14th century land survey. It'll also be based on a land survey from the beginning of the Ottoman period. And there will be, Mohammed Ramzi has a geographical Gazette of Egypt, which has also been very important in developing this. This is really, really important for us because as historians and as archaeologists for this period, when you hear a place name in medieval and Ottoman Egypt, very often people just try to Google it and look it up on Google Maps. We don't really have maps of Mamluk Egypt or Ottoman Egypt. And we don't have a way for historians and archaeologists to kind of interface with a visualization of the landscape during this period. So this is why we're very excited about this, and this will be our the first part of this GIS. And it'll be online, so it'll also be accessible to other students and historians to then approach. But in phase 2, what we're really excited about doing is then opening up layers and having a layer for archaeological work so that all the sites that have been done can be mapped. All of the, you could do a layer on food production. So, Makrizi mentions that in Menfalut, there's a high quality of cattle, and many of the cattle going to Cairo are coming from there. So you could do a map of all the food sources, and you could map these based on these sources, and you could develop these layers. And this is something that we haven't had the ability to do, the ability to visualize our historical or archaeological sources on a map is not something we've really been able to do in a comprehensive and large way in which we could engage together. So the GIS is going to offer that, and phase 2 will be particularly important for that aspect. Phase 2 will also be important because these teams that I mentioned that are going to be doing these case studies of Kafr Sheikh, the Fayoum, and Beni Suef, these 3 areas, they're going to be the centerpiece of the second project, and we're going to be focusing on meeting within these working groups more so that we can talk more about what has been done and what needs to be done, and we can bring together people that are working on the history of these sites, along with specifically archaeologists that have worked on them. We've picked them because there has been archaeological work in those 3 particular places. We also, like I said, want to fill in the layers of the GIS, but we also then are working on developing working groups on specific topics. So one of them being flora and fauna. This is really important because we have very little in the way of studying this during the Mamluk and Ottoman periods. As an example, I can tell you that rice production in the Mamluk period was highly centered around the Fayoum, but during the Ottoman period, it was highly centered in the lakes of the Northern Delta. And we have no idea why the rice production shifted from the Fayoum to the Northern Delta. We just know that it happened because we have so many reports of where each of these is. And this is really important because it also disrupts sugar production because both of them are water intensive. And so they relate to water and landscape usage. But we really don't know anything. So even things about crops and different types of plants and animals, all of these are going to be really relevant for phase 2. So that'll be a working group. Another major working group is related to soil topography and geology. Egypt has a very, in the Mamluk and Ottoman periods and until now, is a very fixed system for categorizing types of soil related to the flood and related to how soil interacts with water and what gets watered, what doesn't get watered, and what is good for growing certain types of crops and what isn't. And that needs to be advanced as a topic. So we're really interested in a soil kind of geology soil working group. And finally, we have to develop some kind of working group to work on villages, oases, and other social units or other community units that are in the rural landscape. And I think most critically, the Coptic monasteries are going to be a focus of phase 2, because these monasteries directed agricultural activities around them and shaped the landscape around them. And so they'll be very important for phase 2 as well. In order to maybe be more successful as a project, phase 2 was also going to include an extension of the timeline. So we may move back a little bit more to the 8th century and move forward a little bit more to the 19th century. Already, we're kind of operating on a longue durée in that it's going from the 13th to the 18th century. But I think we need to think more broadly and make more connections, because in particular, in the 19th century, the landscape changes dramatically because of things that are done in terms of damming the Nile and flood control, but also because of industrial agriculture and changes to the landscape. Many of the dikes and earthworks that were fundamental to the flooding system in the periods that we're interested in were massively disrupted in the 19th century. And so this is part of the challenge of us understanding the landscape, is that a lot of it has been erased. And so I think extending our timeline into the 19th century will also be really important. And I think hopefully the goal, if the project is successful and phase 1 continues to have make the connections and do the things that it's done and kind of introduce this topic, and phase 2 then kind of goes deeper into each of these fields, I really hope then that EG Landscape will have been able to have provided a better portrait by which historians and archaeologists both can situate their work, build upon, and then extend into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anthony,
Do you want me?
maybe you can maybe stay here for a moment.
Okay.
Just stay here. I don't know if we have maybe time for one question, either in the room or online. Nobody's raising a hand online. No.
Well, I'll take I'll break the ice, let's say. And no, it is really interesting to see such organization for a project. And that's why I actually asked you to come here, because it's kind of particular, especially from a historian perspective, to have such a complex, and as you said, it's more like a facilitator rather than really a single research project. And I wanted to ask you eventually, so which is really the integration between the single research pieces. So apart from being a facilitator and occasion to compare with different results, are there really a sort of shared platform on which you develop your own research? Or so if you can tell us a bit more the insight of how it works in practice, let's say so.
Well, in practice, until now, a lot of the people that were working in the project hadn't actually met together in person, even though a lot of them had been working on in various aspects of environmental issues, or they had met incidentally at other things, but not in kind of a coordinated way. And I can say that I know of at least, I would say 4 or 5 actual projects that are now cooperative between members of the project that have happened because of this. So for example, Alison Gascoigne and Zoe Griffith, who is working on these Delta port cities, are now talking about working on a project of their own related to these Delta harbor towns, which would be a fantastic project going forward. So this may yield a new side project. Magdi Gerges working on these Coptic monasteries, in particularly around the area of Ben Nassa, or what is now kind of Beni Suef, is working very closely now with Yossi Rappaport and Nicola to develop a project related to this. So there's now these kind of it's kind of brought everybody together in such a way that these cooperative frameworks are coming out of. I know two people are cooperating, two groups of 2 people, so 4 people, are working on book projects together that would not have come about without this. So in this way, again, they're still working very informally. It's up to them how they coordinate themselves. But EG Landscape created the sphere or the space in which these kind of cooperations could happen. And I think in phase 2, these working groups, we really do want to have them be proper working groups in which eventually there may be a book and a project on each of these 3 case studies, so that we really because there's very little in terms of rural studies outside of Cairo. So if the phase 2 is as successful as we hope it would be, then you would have at least 3 studies on 3 different sites that would be kind of comprehensive and cooperative between historians and archaeologists that would give a new periphery to those types of things.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then
Thank you.
if we don't have any more questions, we will have a short break.
Yes,
15
minutes. Let's
maximum 15 minutes. So we see you at 5 to
55.
55, at 11:55, 5 to 12.
Okay.
Okay. See you.
See you. Thank
Our next speaker is Giorgia Cesaro. She's working for UNESCO as a senior project officer in the UNESCO Jordan office in Amman. So I guess it's online.
Yeah, she's online.
Yes, hi, I'm trying to start the video. It's nice to meet you all virtually. I think I try to stay with the time. I know we're a bit delayed, but my presentation might not be as long as the ones of the colleagues who presented previously. So I will also give a different perspective maybe on things, because this is more about management, heritage management, a bit for an archaeological site, of course, and about landscaping. So I work in Jordan at the UNESCO office in Amman, and we as an office, we have the responsibility to provide technical advice to the national authorities on the preservation of all the heritage of Jordan. Of course, yeah, I've put the map just for whoever is not familiar with Jordan and in the Middle East, of course, and Petra is one of the 6 World Heritage Sites in the country. It was inscribed in the World Heritage List in 1985, and it's one of the most iconic sites in the world, and as everyone might know. It's about 200 kilometers south of Amman, the capital of Jordan, and it's a very well-known site from as a cultural heritage site. So it was inscribed in the World Heritage List for its cultural aspects, as it was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, which in terms of time, dates back to the 6th century BC up until the 4th century AD, more or less, in terms of archaeology, although then there was a Roman conquest in the 2nd century AD and so on. But is very well known for its architecture and for the water management system that characterizes it. So going more into, let's say, UNESCO perspective of things, for who is not familiar with that, sites are inscribed in the World Heritage List based on criteria of understanding universal value. And there are 10 criteria, and the first 7 are related to cultural aspects, and the last are related to natural aspects. So Petra was inscribed as a cultural site in connection to criterion 1, which is linked to sites that are considered masterpieces of human creative genius. It's very technical language, but and of course Petra is such a site. And the criterion number 3, because for sites that are testimonies to special civilization that has still living or has disappeared, in this case the Nabatean civilization, that was actually the Nabatean kingdom was spanning from the southern part of Syria, like Bosra was part of the Nabatean kingdom, towards south up until the south, modern day Saudi Arabia, and Petra was the capital. So, and it's a very specific site because of its rock cut architecture. The monuments are cut in sandstone, so a very friable rock that allowed for monuments to be cut on it. And it's really its architecture, building techniques, and the water management system that characterizes it, that is linked to criteria number 4. However, the site in its own, in reality, is the cultural landscape according to the UNESCO definition. So, and of course, the cultural landscape in general. But this concept came later, was added later to the World Heritage Convention. The convention dates back to 1962, but the cultural landscape concept was developed more in the 1990s and 1992 specifically, and identifies sites that present combined works of nature and humankind, and express the connection between the two. So how the people use the environment, basically, and how the environment and the landscape are particularly prone to be used by men and for their features. So of course they reflect specific techniques of sustainable land use, and this is linked to the natural characteristic of the sites. But of course the protection of natural landscape can contribute to the maintaining over time also all techniques, and also can contribute to biological diversity. From a theoretical point of view, there are two main types of cultural landscapes. One is the one which is really intentionally created by man, for instance, gardens or parks, landscapes, and the ones instead that are so defined, organically evolved landscape. So in this case, they result from social, economic, or administrative imperative that has developed present forms by association. So it's more linked, it's not human-made, it's more linked to the landscape. So it is a different kind of perspective you can look at. And of course, they reflect the process of evolution in their form and components and features. So why Petra is and can be defined as a cultural landscape, although this is not reflected in the nomination of the site as a cultural landscape. First of all, I just go on to the next slide just to give you a sense. The site is huge, so it's 264 square kilometers. So this is the whole site. What the tourist sees in reality is about 50 square kilometers, which is this area here. And maybe might not have the full sense of the site as a whole, but in fact it's very extensive, and it's located in a valley surrounded by mountains, by the Shara Mountains. So it has also a very specific location and a very specific morphology. The cultural component, we have seen it, is very specific, is unique, and this is why it is in the World Heritage List, but it has also a very distinguished natural aspect, which is connected with the sandstone that comprises all the site and its monuments. So it's unique geologically, and is actually thanks to this geology that it was chosen as a site to be a settlement for the Nabatean civilizations. But it has also biological uniqueness. So also in this case, there is very specific fauna and flora all over the site. For instance, the blue lizard is a very specific type of animal that you can see only in Petra. And there is also a very strong human component so the connection of the site with the people. This, of course, was there in ancient times. The site was, of course, the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, and this is the case also today because the community was living in the site itself. So this is the Belgian community. They used to live there until 1985 when the site became World Heritage, and the government of Jordan decided to have the community moved out of the site. But the site has specific traditions that are recognized also by UNESCO as intangible cultural heritage to distinguish them from whatever is tangible. So it's a monument, and this instead is something that is less tangible, but it can be, of course, there is a link to something as tangible as handicrafts, for instance. And but what is important is that these traditions are very much linked to the landscape from which they originate. So the community has specific knowledge that is passed down from generation to generation. So to be considered intangible heritage, the knowledge has to be transmitted orally and from a member of a community to another. And for instance, traditional medicine, this is linked to the plants of the site, or tracking and climbing skills that the community has, or all the camel husbandry and the pastoral habits they do have, and they still have today. These are linked to the place where they live. So there is a very strong connection to the site. And there are 6 communities living around the boundaries of the site that I just shown previously. And of course, this adds complexity in terms of management of the site. From the natural point of view, so I will go back to the natural aspect and I will give you more of an overview about this, also because our office has been implementing several projects related to natural hazards, risk mitigation, as the site is actually exposed to geological and climate-related hazards. So here you can see the top of the Seek, which is a 1.2 kilometers canyon that takes the visitors to one of the most important or very well-known monuments of the site, the Treasury. So let's say the site is exposed to rockfalls, to seasonal floods, and also to earthquakes. Why? Because so rockfalls, of course, because of the typology of stone that comprises the monuments, which is very fragile, the sandstone. Floods, because the site is located, as I was saying, in a valley, in a water basin, where all the wadis take the waters from the surrounding areas. And earthquakes, because is relatively close to the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is along the Reef Valley. We as an office, we've been trying to support the better preservation of the site and also ensuring safety for tourists and visitors by implementing a number of measures to mitigate risk in certain areas, specifically in the Seek. Why? Because the Seek, as I was saying, is this long canyon that has very specific characteristics. So it has very high slopes up to between 70 and 100 meter high. They are very steep, and the path underneath is very narrow. So this makes the site particularly vulnerable whenever there are rockfalls that happen. Let's say there are constant falls of small blocks, although no major incidents happened so far. So because of this situation, we have been working through the support of actually funding from Italy for several years through a program called Seek Stability to fully document the slopes of the Seek and the upper plateau and to understand which were the most unstable areas prone to rockfalls through the installation of an integrated monitoring system. And after about 3 years of monitoring, the systems that we've been used are topographic monitoring, but also wireless monitoring through the installation of different devices on specific cracks. And the full documentation, not through LiDAR, unfortunately. We've been doing that through photogrammetry and 3D laser scanning, and we've been developing a GIS for the sick. Specifically, we have been trying to implement a number of measures to prevent rock falls through dislodging loose blocks from the slopes with Jordanian climbers and cleaning the upper sick area. This is to give you a sense of how, what's the shape of the sick, that the entrance is from here and the end is in this area where there is the treasury, and below you see the point cloud taken from the laser scanner with more details. So what we've been doing is that we've been eventually carrying out two types of interventions after a data gathering process. One is a structural intervention that led to the stabilization of 5 unstable blocks on the sick. This was done with professional climbers, rock climbers that you can see working here. And these are the type of works that have been implemented in actually 2021. So we had to stop during the pandemic, but in fact, the beginning of last year was very good because there were no tourists, so we could actually work very well on the slopes. But, and this is a bit more related to the landscape aspect I wanted to focus on, we have also been doing, in fact, landscaping rehabilitation in the top part of the Siq, in the plateaus. This is a completely different environment from the lower part of the canyon. Here we've been working starting from 2016, the first time we did it, with the local community. We've been hiring 50 people that at the time there wasn't too much tourism, so they were also unemployed and they were happy to work with us, and they've never been themselves on the top of the Siq, even if they were coming from neighboring villages. And so from the local communities, really. What we've been doing is that we've been mapping and dividing in sections the whole plateau by using forms through which we could actually map what were the archaeological features, what the geological features, which was the risk associated to these areas. And we've been implementing a number of measures, very simple measures. We've not been working on archaeological features in this case. We've been actually building so-called debris terraces to trap the debris and to avoid that the debris would go into the Siq and cause falls, divert the water so that it could go into the wadis that are not towards the Siq itself, but to the side wadis. We've been remodeling blocks that were dangerous and a risk to fall, and we've been stabilizing other blocks. This is a kind of intervention that should be done and repeated, maintained every year by the Petra Park. Unfortunately, despite our recommendations, this did not happen. Therefore, when more funding came to be available a few years after, so, and here we are in 2020, we did the maintenance ourselves, but it actually 4 years passed, and we have been working in a wider area. So here you can see from the aerial photo the Siq. We were working previously mainly on the edge because the priority was to prevent falls into the canyon, but then we've been expanding in the plateaus themselves. And here, yes, there were actually archaeological features because and this is a landscape that was used by the Nabateans, and how they were using it. They were using it for agricultural purposes, or like they were themselves, they were managing the waters to prevent, of course, floods going to the Siq, but to keep the overflow. And the overflow was used for agricultural purposes on these two plateaus, and this is very clear. So what we have been trying to do was to rehabilitate the ancient Nabatean landscape, to keep it as it was, prevent soil erosion, and at the same time, we tried as much as possible to mitigate the risks. This is the mapping we did before the start of the works. We could not work everywhere due to time limitations and funding limitations, but we did work northeast part, which is the southern part of the Sikh. This is the northern part, this is Jabal Khupta. And here we couldn't work, but we worked in the south here and also along the trail to the high place of sacrifice and along the Wadi Farasa trail. We've been working with the local communities again. This time we were able to employ 82 people through a casual work methodology. Up to 25% women, and this is the kind of works that we've been doing in those areas. On this image on the bottom right, you can see some examples of debris flow here and the rockfalls on the top. Sorry, debris fall and rockfall on the top along the trail to the high place of sacrifice. So these areas are not normally maintained by the park. So we have been trying to support as much as possible in that. But the work along the trails has in fact expanded also to other areas of the site by adopting the same approach. So here in this slide, I give you a bit of a summary. So overall, we worked at 4 trails, 2 the ones that I mentioned, very close to the Sikh and located on the upper plateaus of Petra, and other 2 trails that I will show you now. Overall, in 2 years, we were able to employ 230 people, 25% women and 4% persons with disabilities. They were all coming from the communities around the site. It's very important to mention that all communities were involved. So for whoever knows the social situations in Petra, there are some communities that got more income from the site. In this case, there was an equal distribution, a fair distribution of jobs at a time in which there were no job opportunities during the pandemic, because we started the work in June 2020. And by providing basic training to the local communities on heritage rehabilitation and landscaping, we were able to work really well and to achieve very good results. And we hope that the most skilled among these workers will be able to work again with the park, be employed again by the government, basically. So this is one of the other trails we worked on. It's called Unishu Trail. It goes from the Street of Facades. The Street of Facades follows after the treasury up until the so-called royal tombs that are here. This area was not visited much, and the park authority asked us to make it accessible from this side, while before it was accessible only from the other side, and very few people were actually realizing that there was a trail there. And also because the site was covered with vegetation, was not understandable. There were traditional terraces that were not visible and they needed to be rehabilitated. So we've been doing that. And as you can see, so terraces were in here. Also because this is a small wadi, so a small river where water collects during the rainy season, basically. It's a very small one. And we have been also rebuilding some ancient retaining walls, mainly dating back to Nabatean period by using lime-based mortars. So, and we have been explaining and teaching the technique to the community. This is another trail instead, which is not in the center of the site. It's located a bit more far away in the north, close to the area called Little Petra. It's a very long trail that takes visitors from Little Petra up until the monastery, which is the second mostly known monument in Petra. It's a beautiful trail, but it was not really understandable. People without the guide would have not been able to to take it. And what's important is that this area, all this area, was agricultural area back in Nabatean times, and there are in fact wine presses spread all over. They were cultivating wine, white wine there already at the time, and why? Because also there are a number of wadis, of rivers, torrential rivers that in this area. So it was a good area to do that. And so what we've been doing is really to work with the landscape by rebuilding agricultural terraces also in this case. And we've been also backfilling wadis that were crossing the trail, and so they were not allowing people to easily walk on it. There are Nabatean features all over the path. There is also a Nabatean press that we've been working on. And the village of Beda is a Neolithic village, very famous as a type site. And we have been working there while fencing it. And sorry, I didn't put that many photos. But we've been doing not only the presentation of the site has been improved, but also we were able to work on some of the old structures. And we've been working also in this area, which is the first part of the trail. I forgot to say we didn't work on the whole trail up to the monastery. We worked on the first two sections up until the staircase that takes to the monastery, because the last part was the works were already carried out by the Petra authority. We didn't have time, we didn't have enough funds as well. In this first section, so-called Unkusa, you can really see how the landscape was used already in Nabatean times. So there are several water cisterns, and you see here really different periods. You can see not only the Nabatean period, but also the Islamic period. So there are two mosques, one here and one here. There is also a church inside a cave. So the landscape was really used for that. And the Nabatean part of the site is mainly here instead. So this area is not visited at all. So we've been creating a path that by cleaning the site, and this, of course the path needs to be maintained. And this is a bit of the challenge. And we've been also preparing interpretation panels to explain the area to tourists. It's used also nowadays, so there is still this strong connection with the site because there is the cemetery from the Amarin tribe that comes from here and has the village now outside the park boundaries, because this is inside the park boundaries now. So they actually have been relocated outside, just beyond this road that represents the boundary of the site. But the cemetery is still there, and it will be maintained there. So this is just to draw some conclusions of the work done. We as an office and as UNESCO, we've been trying to involve as much as possible the communities in the preservation of their own heritage. This didn't used to be the case several years ago. There was the idea of preserving the monument on its own without in fact involving the community. This approach has changed in the past 15 years. And this should be seen the way to go, because there should be the communities that take care of their own heritage, and mostly so in cases like this where the community was living in the site and is still living next to the site. So they are the best placed to take care of it. And this message has been passed also to the authorities. Then of course, the landscape needs to be maintained. It needs to be maintained. It cannot stay. It needs to be preserved, and it's fundamental. And this is part of a joint effort. Of course, it should be done. There are certain interventions that can be carried out by the local community, others that can be done by specialists, but there should be an integration of these two approaches. And I think, yes, I will stop here. And thank you very much. I hope I was able to give you an overview, a quick overview of the work done and the UNESCO approach in terms of preservation of heritage nowadays in Jordan.
Thank you very much. We have time maybe for one question.
Well, I'll go for it. And so thank you very much, George, again. Just a quick question, actually. So you showed at the beginning that the site, so the UNESCO site of Petra is huge compared to the part of the site which is actually mostly visited by tourists. My question was, so you showed that most of the activities that UNESCO has been doing, especially as far as monitoring the natural environment, was along the sea and where the tourists mostly are. Are there also monitoring systems or, in a way, methods of assessment of the status of the natural environments also in other parts of the UNESCO site, or is just limited to those areas?
Yes, thank you for the question. Unfortunately, the monitoring is related to that area specifically. Also, I didn't go into detail because of there was not enough time, and we've been working on in terms of monitoring of instability phenomena. We've been installing, as I was saying, a wireless system, and this system, in fact, lasted for 3 years, but then was vandalized, for instance. So one issue is the maintenance of whatever type of monitoring system is installed, and maintenance is a bit of a problem. This is because of the lack of human resources to do that, and and also a bit of the mentality of the park in that sense. So for rock slope instability, the system was only in the SIC because that was considered a priority area because we had funding for that. But of course, this is an approach that could be applied to many other areas in the site. Another type of monitoring that is not there, but it would be very useful, is monitoring for flash floods. And also in that case, it was UNDP that installed a system in Wadi Musa for the monitoring of floods, and it was an alarm system. And also in that case, it lasted just very shortly and was almost never used. So it's also important to assess the type of investment vis-a-vis, in fact, really the use of the system. So yeah, so if you were referring to this type of monitoring, unfortunately, no, it's not used anywhere else. And it should be, there is the need, of course, but maintenance has to be ensured. Otherwise, it risks to be a bit of a loss of funding and effort.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Can you maybe unshare your PowerPoint, because I cannot see for the user. Nicola is following. We have no other question. Then thank you again, Georgia, and I think we will have this concludes this morning session, and we will have a lunch break.
A lunch break, and we'll